to the Dark Path podcast. This is just a weekly update, as I like to call them, which has been a little bit more than a week since the last one, but I did get the interview out with John Foster on psychology, deep psychology, depth psychology, and I think it was very worthwhile, very interesting conversation, and I hope everyone enjoyed it. Things are picking up again a little bit in my other side of my life, and being busy, and this podcast is certainly not something that's making any money, so it's something I'm doing with my spare time. I'm keeping the ball rolling, and I have a lot more stuff planned, but I'll definitely be continuing with the weekly updates at a bare minimum, with much more on the way. So today, being as though the last time I did one of these, the world was quite a bit different than it is now. We've rapidly seen a shift in the overall situation. I thought I would reflect back on that a lot, because I think the last time I did an update, the trucker protest in Ottawa was still raging, and there was no particular focus on Ukraine and that situation. And since then, holy cow, absolutely crazy. I do want to say that I watched the way things played out in Ottawa with dismay, deep dismay, and that is still being sorted out, and it will take time to sort out, but it must be sorted out properly. Today, Tamara Lich, the one of the organizers there, she finally was released on bail, so it's about damn time. But I think what really changed things was the Ukraine situation, and I think the reason that did that was because it's a real war. It's not a political fight. It's not a fight of words and rules and things that are kept within the context of what society sort of is supposed to be. A war is when the rules change, and what matters is whether or not you survive, essentially. And so that throws a wrench into the gears of things, but in a way it does bring home reality a lot more. And you see this with people, I find this interesting and terrible, is the recognition of the seriousness of what's happening in Ukraine overwhelms the focus on other things that are happening, say, domestically back here in Canada, let's say. So we still have in BC, particularly BC being an outlier, but some ridiculous restrictions and limitations based on COVID. Kids are still being masked up in school all freaking day. It's ridiculous this is still happening. But I've heard this sentiment coming from people of, well, at least it's not as bad as in the Ukraine, or because you can see in the Ukraine that things could get a lot worse, and it's like, that's not a reasonable comparison. I mean, on a number of levels, not the least of which being that the whole point of having any dialogue about the direction a society is taking is to avoid the pitfalls that ultimately do lead to either war, whether it's an external war or a civil war or whatnot. It's to avoid the outcome of violence. And I want to talk about that today, is violence, and how violence is at the heart of war and whatnot. And this is because, as much as all the things that are going on in the world are significant, we all know that war, which comes with this attachment of death and other things, other very nasty things, is this kind of absolute that we don't want to hit. I think most people would agree with that. And so, in talking about that and thinking about that, I want to share a book that I really feel like had changed my life, affected me a lot. It was published in, I think, 2006. It says in here, 2004. Yeah, that makes more sense. So I picked it up pretty soon after it was published, and it was one of these things where I just happened to be in a bookstore, and the title caught my eye. And the title caught my eye for a couple reasons. one of them is that I definitely have always been interested in trying to understand the human mind in the way that, whether it's psychology or other theories, trying to map out and understand what the anatomy of the mind is, why the functions work with the way they do, what the relationships between different parts are. And of course that was what we were talking largely to John Foster with on the last podcast. So I have an interest in that anyways. And I had picked up, even by my early 20s, I had picked up on this idea that there's behavioral patterns that are likened to these things called archetypes, which is you could think of a performer, a person that has an incredibly magnetic, charismatic personality and can just lead a crowd through all kinds of, whether they're speaking or singing or whatever they're doing. That person has a certain character to them. There's this performer, and it can be placed on, a whole huge variety of people, but it's still the same intangible energy somehow. And this would be considered an archetype. And then there's other archetypes. Maybe the archetype of the farmer, the archetype of the king and the queen, of course, are big ones. But then the archetype of the warrior, of course, is another big one. That's kind of what we're going to touch on today. So anyways, that was already in my head. But also, in conjunction with that, I had grown up with family and close friends of the family that are involved in the military. Some cases involved in World War II, in the older generation when I was little, and other cases involved with more modern military affairs. But in any case, there was an exposure to military, and the consequences of that were something I was aware of since a young age. And so I think for those reasons, which are similar reasons in a way, the book caught my eye, and it's called A Terrible Love of War by an author named James Hillman. He's more famous for a book called The Soul's Code, which is somewhere in the same sort of arena that maybe Eckhart Tolle could be sort of thrown into, I guess. But I'm not super familiar with his other work. This one book, though, it brought home something to me that really has always helped me understand war and violence and chaos in the world. And it doesn't make it easier, it doesn't make it better, because it's still a horrific and terrible thing, but it's not as hard to fathom why it continues. Maybe that's a depressing thought. But anyways, I wanted to share the idea of the book, and I wanted to use the chapters of the book, there's only 4 of them, as jump-off points for some ideas on conflict and battle and war and death and all of these things, because they're ideas that I think are right at the heart of any serious question about how society should function and go forward, and how we can all improve the world. And all of these fundamental questions you have to take in this very seriously, this component of human behavior that at its worst is expressed as war. But let's start with this: aggression. And this is the first chapter in the book. Let me get to that. Aggression is definitely a natural thing. Animals have lots of aggression in different ways, and they're aggressive. Whether you can sort of categorize and say, they're aggressive because of social dynamics, and they're trying to hierarchy of their social group, or their predator-prey relationships, and there's aggression there. Territorial disagreements. There's definitely aggression, and that aggression is, in the animal kingdom, you can't say it's a negative thing, you can't say it's a bad thing, it's part of how survival works, because ever since there was enough life on the planet to compete for resources, then the competition has always been life and death, because those resources are life. And so nature gave animals this push to really, really, really go for it when it comes to surviving. And of course, we've had so many millions of species come and go, and this has just been the way of it since the beginning. So life is driven to it forcefully survive if that's what it has to do. And for most animals, that is how it has to survive. The entire class of animals that we call predators, what else are they going to do? They're not going to gently take down their prey. They're going to have to take it down with some serious intensity. And that intensity is violent in a sense, although we don't judge it morally. But that is sort of the basis for what the first chapter in the book wants to talk about, which is that war is, in the human experience, normal, in that there has been more war than there has been sustained peace. Most people don't understand how significant and unusual it has been for people in, say, Canada here to have had a couple generations in a row without a significant war. That's not the normal situation for humankind. And it becomes, I think, from the outside from the inside looking out, which is to be in this culture and having grown up that way, I think it becomes very easy to forget what that means. And we people observe a Remembrance Day, although I thought last Remembrance Day was particularly strange because, what does freedom mean exactly is a question that I think more people need to ask. But there was this idea that we do need to remember that, but why? Why does that keep happening? Why does violence pop up in the human experience historically again and again and again and again? It might be that for the first time in history we get a chance to really reflect on this as a large group because we can communicate the way we are. Like right now, this podcast, or with your friends, you can text about it. And therefore we can have a better discussion about this, because I don't think anybody, nobody I know specifically, and most people in general, I don't think would just say that they just want people to die. Nobody wants that. So how does that get resolved? Well, I think we can start with this idea that aggression is natural, and that because aggression is natural, we've never had a time without war. And so when we take on the task of trying to figure out how to go forward in the future without that, we have to recognize the weight of the hubris of that situation, because there's a lot there that needs to be, accepted. So if aggression is normal, if aggression is a natural expression of life, and that we are absolutely born out of that, we're at least born with that potential, and that potential can't be turned off, then how does society sustain peace at all? Well, it tends to create ceremonial, ritualized behaviors that channel that aggression. It creates sports where that aggression can be focused within the parameters of a set of rules that don't hurt, at least don't kill people, and even if they get a little bruised up in certain sports, in that sense. In social competition that still exists, which it's always going to exist. As far as I can fathom it, we're always going to be like competing with each other for status in some way. And so that kind of aggression is it can be integrated, and the distinction between the physicalized violence can be established. And I think in a lot of ways we've done a pretty good job of this in Western culture for the last while, but we think we've forgotten the seriousness of why that difference matters. And so again, from the first chapter of the book as my reference point, while war has been normal throughout human history, I'm saying that for a large part of that reasoning is because aggression is a natural part of the expressions of all life. And so it's on us to find a better way to focus that aggression. Now, the next chapter in the book is kind of the other side of the coin. So if the first chapter is to establish as a principle this idea that violence, as it emerges out of the aggressive tendencies of life, is normal. It's just part of the way things have always worked. So that we can, part of it I think is we can become used to its occurrence in, at least historically. We don't have to be shocked by it. We can just start to look at it with a calmer, more even mind. And that doesn't take away from the power of it in a negative sense. Some of the atrocities that have been committed in human history are just atrocious, no doubt. But if we've got to dissect it without getting emotionally caught up in that dissection. That's important. And this is a big part of what the dark path concept for me means, is to go into, say, a war crime that's committed. And it could be a war crime on either side of the teams according to what you're supposed to like or not like. It's an investigation of how that human behavior manifests at all that becomes the focus to me. And there is something that's fairly universal about not just the extreme end of things where violence becomes uncontained completely and is often what we call a war crime, but also within the rules of combat, as it were. There's a thread there, and it's that when you're fighting the enemy can't be a human being to you. They have to be just the enemy. Psychologically, there's something profound about looking into another person in the eyes and still being willing to kill them. That is a very different thing than, shooting a target on a computer screen. And that has been so denigrated in the last 100 and some odd years as the industrialization of equipment and manufacturing has changed war so dramatically. But it matters because if we can't get a handle on our nature in this way, the danger of labeling a group as an outsider group and stripping them, even in a small degree, of their humanity becomes seriously possible and seriously dangerous. And so there's two things within that are relevant here in today's world that I think I should point out is, and again, this is the basis of this, is that in order to be able to kill a human being, for most people that aren't sociopathic, that human being has to be stripped of their humanity. And how do you really recognize the humanity of another person? You look them in the eyes. The eyes are the window to the soul, as they say. Well, it's more than just the eyes, even though the eyes are in many ways a focal point. It's the face. It's the ability to look a person in the face, in the eyes, and see the individual there. See that they have an individual life, that they have an individual family, that they have passions and dreams and hopes and cares like anybody else, like you do. And once that's seen, it's hard to overcome that knowledge. Just prevents you from, for most people, again, if you're not naturally sociopathic, it prevents you from acting negatively towards that person unnecessarily because you know that they're like you. And so we've seen, and this is just to connect this to our contemporary setting in Canada, is we've seen a tool, this thing called a mask, being used to take away 2/3 of the face on everybody for a couple of years. And nobody's thought about the ramifications of that. And yet, we've never, divisiveness is certainly going on everywhere you look, so, there might be a connection. And the other part of that connects, and is like, to me, is like the big concern, even though the mask thing is a concern, is, we were just trying, the media and the government just trying to give us a group to blame for the problems that are occurring because of the lack of maturity and proper taking of responsibility in our government. And that group was inherently already stripped of most of their humanity for not being willing to participate in an experimental medical procedure. Like that's part of this danger, is that it isn't that war suddenly pops on your doorstep tomorrow and all these things happen. It's that the mind gets funneled into a place where there's the appropriate elements are in place. So there's a group you can blame, and then they're not human. You're allowed to then, there's implicit or sometimes explicit permission given to just, torture and killing these people at some point. So this is why, though, I think there's such a strong response to actual violence when it occurs, even if it's misguided. People's response to unnecessary killing is always quite visceral, and it should be, because it takes away the human side of things, and that's our way forward in a good way. If we want to go forward in a good way, we can recognize that our history is absolutely full of war and death, but as we go forward, we can focus on the humanity of each other and the individual recognition of each other. In martial arts, there's a lot of bowing in traditional martial arts, but that's what that's there to reinforce, is that you're dealing with another real person, another actual person, even if they're in a different rank and you're, there's a relationship of hierarchy there, there's still a person. Yoga, of course, has the namaste concept, which is essentially the same thing. And this is how we go forward without the worst end of violence manifesting. So I find it interesting to watch on the news right now, or little news feeds, that I see that the civilians, the people in Ukraine, the people in Russia and stuff, there is a lot of backlash against this, and it's a unique kind of backlash to me, where the recognition is that there's these world powers that are just disconnected from their lives, and they're doing something that they don't want them to do, and they just want them to stop. They just stop doing that. Most people can accept that they're going to have leaders in their countries and their and all this, but they just stop being so easily drawn into this. Not that anything about the Ukrainian situation is easily, it's been years in the making. But I don't know a whole lot more about that one, so I don't want to get too much into it. Now, jump ahead to the heart of the matter in many ways. So we have this situation where, for all of human history, there has been violence, and that violence is largely born out of a natural impulse to establish oneself in the environment, in the social hierarchy, in life, and that all things have this drive, and that drive could be called aggression. But that we also have become self-conscious enough to know that if we can't look at another person and see another human being, then the door is open to absolute savagery. But if we do look at another person and see them as such another person, then that door closes, and the likelihood of brutal behavior gets shut down quite a bit more, because it's in the recognition of the humanness of each other, the humaneness of each other, that we can steer away from the worst end of the aggressive tendencies we have, but we can't get rid of them. And that means that, I think anyways, that means that things like UFC fighting or hockey or race car driving, or you could go into the little circles of people that are pursuing making the most money they can in the stock market. These are all aggressive driven things. They want to get out on top and win and everything, but they're contained within, at least ideally, they're contained within a framework that is both legal and doesn't directly kill anyone anyways, and society sort of accepts, and that's fine, that's good, especially with sports. I really like sports for that, because it's a way to really physicalize that expression, and I think that's important too. But there's another thing about war and death that I think brings it all home, sort of connects all of this stuff, especially the question of, why does this keep happening? And it's right at the heart of so many human problems. And so the third chapter in the book speaks directly to this, I think, which is to say war, and I would really say that here, what they're talking about is death. Death is sublime. Now, again, being that I've named the podcast the Dark Path Podcast, I have a focus towards the dark side of life, in the sense that that's what needs to be brought to light, or for the movement forward to be done well. And so there's nothing darker than death. Whatever death is, whatever happens after that, there's no way of confirming it, and it's the ultimate unknown. And so it's the darkest unknown in many ways. But it also, we know that what it is, amongst other things, is that it's the end of the experience here. Whatever this is, and whatever life is, that does come to some kind of definitive end for the individual. And that then represents a boundary between this world and whatever else might be out there. And of course, you don't have to believe anything else is out there, but it certainly represents something happening that ends one thing. And if it doesn't begin another thing, that end is still a potent, energetic dynamic. And so if you've ever been in presence of someone who dies, or even in the presence of animals, maybe you disagree with me, but I have both, definitely with animals. There's something to it. There's something there. It's not a huge. You have to be paying attention. You have to be kind of calm. You have to be able to be honest with yourself and everything. But it's there. And so when it's more intense, though, it's understood that it gets much more dynamic. I don't think dynamic might not be the right word, but whatever it is that animates the experience of witnessing being near death. When that death is violent, dramatic, it's even more intense. And a large component of that really confuses and PTSD issues is that there is something sublime about the experience. Because like the mind, some of you may have had a really bad car accident, for example, and if you haven't, and I hope you haven't, you can imagine somebody who has telling you a story where they said that the experience of time during the accident, both at some ways seemed really fast, like it all happened at once, but also really slow, where they can see, like maybe if the car's rolling, they can actually see the car rolling as if it's in slow motion. And what that is because the mind does shift out of normal day-to-day consciousness in those moments. They're considered, I always consider it a kind of a flashpoint thing, where you're so overstimulated with some kind of experience that your mind goes out of normal day-to-day consciousness into something else, and a little bit uncontrollably in these cases. But those shifts in consciousness, which, as I'm saying, can happen during traumatic experiences, there's something very similar to those and things that are ascertained through great deals of sort of meditative effort in spiritualities, or potentially even with the use of certain kinds of drugs, because, well, I mean, fundamentally, most people only think of their day-to-day consciousness as what consciousness is, but there's certainly more to it than that. And when you shift out of that consciousness, that experience is usually called sublime, and it could be for good or bad, of course. So let's take the example. I love heavy metal, and I mean I like absolute death metal, I like progressive black death metal. I don't want to listen to Dying Fetus every day, all day long, but I certainly like listening to them. And that's an interesting thing. So what do I like about it? Well, when I hear those types of songs, the sound waves are just overwhelming. There's just so much going on. It's so intense. It's so fast and so powerful. But I enjoy it. And so why do I enjoy it? Because it stimulates a state of consciousness that's somewhat hyper alert maybe, and very stimulated to act, very empowered, very pushed forward. And this is something that most people enjoy feeling. I mean, people that like stimulants too much, it's essentially what they're chasing. And in many ways, the intense music is kind of a stimulant. And there's good and bad in that, of course, but that is touching on something that's more than just enjoyable. There's something sublime about it because it's shifting you out of that day-to-day consciousness. And so when we think about traumatic experiences in death and war, there is more to it than just horror in that sense. There's an ambivalent nature to a lot of it. Like, so for instance, imagine tribal warfare, so like early primitive human warfare. Often you would have a personal knowledge of the people that you're the person that say you're going after, and if you did defeat them, there would be incredible elation in that sense. It's tied into these natural sociological behaviors. But then there's the aspect of it where it goes beyond even that, where I was down in Mexico and I saw the Pyramid of the Sun, and saw where the human sacrifices, some of them anyways, were done. And I really thought about like what that would look like to an observer of that. And you know, we think of the horror of it, but there's something about those experiences that it is transcendent in some way, some horrible way. The killing of another creature, especially a human being, in such a manner, it's going to cause an effect. Your mind's going to shift. Both Dan Carlin has a really amazing podcast about painfotainment, I think he calls it, where he talks about this evolution, how it occurred in European history. And then also Daryl Cooper in the Modern Made podcast did one that I really liked when he was talking about the history of cannibalism and how it's sort of the root of a lot of these sacrificial behaviors, which later on become completely symbolically played out, but are kept there because they connect a person to something that's greater than just the day-to-day. And nothing grabs the mind, as I said, more powerfully as the unknown that death represents. So, in many ways, I don't think that the sublime and even the sacred could exist without death. And that's because if death didn't exist, the severity of the consequences of choice wouldn't matter as much. This has been played out on some TV shows, I'm sure, but if you can't be killed, then who cares what you do? It doesn't matter. But because death exists and it's absolute, well, it definitely matters what you choose to do. And so much of this, and this goes back to that idea of the first chapter, the idea that war is normal, is just intrinsically part of life. But what we value and what we want to use to move forward, our humanity, it's not that it's antithetical to war as much as that it kind of is, I guess, but it's a different direction than the indulgence of that behavior. That behavior has to be kind of like the way that a little kid might have aggressive tendencies and they need to be taught you can't behave that way. You have to change that. You fill in the raw aggression with symbolic gesture or verbal dialogue or something like this. And that begins with, and that centers around with the recognition of each other as human beings, as equal human beings to each other. And then in order to hold and sustain a society, some methods for connecting with the sublime or the sacred aspects of life have to be in place and available, and that ties into the desire for extremes that people have. And so there's something sublime about an athlete just pushing the human potential to the absolute limit of what's possible, and witnessing that you get filled with something about it, because it really brushes up on the border on of possibility, and this is wonderful. And that athlete, you can say is aggressively taking themselves to that highly potent state of mind and focus and power, and pushing they're not having long form conversations with the other players on the other team about being nice. They're absolutely trying to win at the highest focus, but that's how you get there, is that kind of shift. So this then represents to me what the balance that can be aimed at, that works is that we can't get rid of and we shouldn't want to get rid of the drive to push, to be intense, to outcompete. We should just find ways of funneling that energy that are productive. And the way that we keep society from disintegrating and denigrating into a really any dangerous places, and there's a number of ways we can do this, is never allowing any group of people to be identified with something that isn't equally valid as you are. So that's holding on to our mutual humanity with each other, and then driving those intense, aggressive tendencies into appropriate venues. I often use about the idea that we could have it set up that you could sign up for a personal grudge match boxing thing where you get an actual referee, and then a medical person would be there, and then you could put on the gloves and you go into a ring, and you just people go at it and just sort of like, you know, take out their anger at each other in that way. I mean, and it's not like that's the most safe thing in the world, but it's certainly a lot safer than letting people fight in the dark alleys with knives. And maybe that's not a great idea, but it's just the idea then of consciously focusing where that energy goes within society and allowing that to be natural, and then providing a way for people to connect with the sacred. And this is definitely not the government's responsibility at all, but as a community, as an individual, finding ways to make the sacred a realistic possibility within the choices the person has in their life, and stay in touch with that. And then that represents connection with, well, ultimately death. Because that's what all stories are teaching us, is cycles. And the cycle at the end has to be accepted. And that brings me to the final chapter in the book. As again, these are just starting points. This is not what's in the book specifically. I highly recommend reading it, of course, but that's a whole different thing. I'm just using these as jumping points because they really represent, again, to me, like this idea of how to sort of make sense of this, even if it's not like, you know, overly optimistic. It helps make sense of it. And so the final chapter is called Religion is War. Now, whenever I bring that one up, I always like to point out that I know that Hillman did not mean to infer that war as a negative, like religion is the cause of war or anything like that. It's the nature of the idea of the struggle towards whatever you want to frame the good as, whether that's God or whatever else. It's not easy, you know. Take an example of like a person born into the lap of luxury. They're like a trust fund kid, and everything is always paid for them and everything like that. But they have inherited a huge fortune. And most people think about that. Oh, well, that person's, how could they ever complain about anything? But if they're actually a moral person and they really care about the world, then that huge amount of money they inherited is actually a giant responsibility. And they have very serious worries and concerns then if they care about how they utilize that money towards any greater good for the world. And so there's a struggle there. And there's no way that you could have any situation in which you're aiming at bettering the world and yourself in which there isn't going to be a pushback, because the world is just not set to be easy. It's just how it is. And so religion in that sense is always saying, whatever religion it is, that this is a guideway through this process of life. And that means that religion is almost arming you for that battle, for that conflict. And I think a lot of religious people would agree with that. I think that could be fairly universally accepted. But there's another deeper part of that too, which connects to the sublime element, and the idea that violence and death bring out an aspect of the self that is often very deeply hidden. And that is what happens when a person, especially a person whose natural tendency is to be very aggressive, is given sort of a space to do that in a totally unhinged way. Like the Vikings had these guys called berserkers that apparently would even take magic mushrooms, go into battle naked, and were just out of their heads. And what is that? What's coming out there? And it's it's fiery and intense. And I think that is something religion is trying to house and contain, and it helps quite a bit to do that, actually. That idea of something that is deep inside the human soul that emerges in certain circumstances that can be catastrophic. I think about that quote I learned about it like most of us do. Is a quote that was quoted by Oppenheimer at the detonation of the first nuclear blast, and he was quoting the Bhagavad Gita, of course, and he was saying, I have become death, the destroyer of worlds. That feeling is inherently inside, and it can get drawn out, and religion gives it this frame that is trying to contain it. And so, Christianity would be the devil, and the temptations of Christ and all this. But there's a million different versions of that story in a million different ways. So religion is tied to it. Spirituality is tied to this. They're all tied to this battle between good and evil, ultimately. And of course, what's evil in this sense? Well, it's that which undoes life, that which is antithetical to existence and ultimately to thriving. And it's here too that if we're careful about this, I think that the power and the transcendent nature of what this all means to the mind, which is based on that recognition of the severity of death, the absolute nature of death, can be, as it was in other cultures, sort of the binding force that holds so much holds our stability together, because we're all limited by that reality. We're all limited by the resources, food. Our lives are finite, and that connects all of us. And then not only that, we're really fragile creatures as human beings. So we need a lot of infrastructure around us at all times to survive. These things matter, and so if we can embrace that understanding and frame our lives and society in such a way that the beneficial aspects of the intense energy that we can call aggression, or we can sort of call it just willpower or whatever it is, can be utilized in a positive way, and we can stay in touch with the sacred and not lose our humanity amongst each other, and therefore balance out the difference between wanting to win and push and hold your space, and knowing that war is not literal war is not actually on the table. It'd be a good option. And let me finish this part of the conversation with this. Why does it matter? Why does it matter so much that actual war is not on the table? And the reason is because death, the power of death is absolute. So if you think about two people have a conflict, and maybe they go to a judge, right? Some small claims court judge or something in that sense. Once the judgment's made, then it's made, and then the two people go off into their lives and live with the consequences. But if they were in a society where blood feuds were still expressed, and the decision, and it was like acceptable that the complainant, the person who's got the complaint against the other person just attacks and kills the other person, and then their family would come back and you get this whole eye for an eye thing, and it doesn't go away. So we need this we need this stand-in that society creates that's fair and disconnected from the individual drive that leads people to want to hurt each to settle squares in that way, to settle their anger in that way. But that has to be within a society that's framework is based on actual recognition of every individual's right to go through life unharassed. And then that is the balance of what a good society does. Now, I don't know if that really was a great insight into anything necessarily, but those are some of the thoughts that are at the heart of so much of what matters to me in terms of all that's going on in the world. And I don't mean to say that I have any sort of authoritative, definite claim to fame here in any way. These are just sort of ongoing discussions, and part of what I want to do with future guests coming up would be to talk about some of the stuff and learn and hopefully evolve the idea. But what I was trying to get at today then with this conversation is a few of the things that I think are just important if you want to try to make sense of violence in anywhere in the world. Is it's just part of how it's always been. and it comes out of natural tendencies that all living creatures have, and that the inhuman part, the part it has sort of two sides where like to go towards a better future, it's by recognition of our of our own humanity and our humanity of others. But once that is discarded, and then atrocities are easily committed because there's no humanness there. It's just it's all become abstract separation, and so and then finally that the sacred and sublime and religion and spirituality are deeply threaded into these issues, and there's almost sort of no way of disconnecting them essentially. And this is all actually very empowering, even if it's not necessarily something a person is normally sort of considered to be the way of it. But if you were omnipotent and omnipresent, then there would be no surprises, there would be no struggle, there would be no issues, there would be no worry, there would be no concern. All of these things are born out of the fact that whatever this experience of life is, there's a lot of questions that we can't answer at any given time, so we have to just take things as they come. And that's okay. It's actually kind of fun. But let's not go down any roads that lead to absolute true violence. I think we've done that enough in history. I think we've hurt each other enough in history, and I mean that, we hurt each other. We're all part of a human family. Whenever one person is killed, another, on these scales, it comes back to bite us all in the ass ultimately, because it's the nature of those kinds of behaviors. And it's also the reason why it matters so much if we live in a truly free country or not, and whether or not free will and free expression and free speech are acknowledged, is because those are one of the only things that actually keep us from falling into a world where some amount of death and chaos are inevitable. And also that we have desires and proclivities, and this is everybody, that most people, maybe you haven't thought about your attraction to violent scenes in violent movies. You haven't thought about it as something that you're attracted to, but it's okay to think about it that way, because it gives you a more honest view of what's going on. Why does your adrenaline spike up when you watch a horror movie? Well, because it's in stimulating fright, but it's doing it kind of a safe way, and that's kind of fun. It's like a roller coaster. And being honest about it means though that you can sort of you can do a lot better job of keeping those impulses in check, because you're not trying to hide from yourself what they're about. So having said that, I think that'll do for today. It's been a crazy week and a half, and it'll probably be another crazy week ahead, but I'll put out another one in another week, and hopefully we'll get some more guests up here pretty quick, which we definitely will, but I mean time-wise, I'll find the time to edit it all up. And I'm thinking about putting up a website pretty soon now too, and lots more other stuff. So thank you so much for your time. Have a great day, morning, afternoon, whatever it might be, and we'll see you again soon.